Story number 1. The Changeling. I've always loved watching my daughter Molly play. Her laugh, her energy, it was like seeing pure sunlight, bottled and given to me in a little girl. She was the whole reason I'd crawl out of bed at the crack of dawn for work and endure every grueling second, all to come home at night and hold her in my arms, to hear her whisper, "Daddy," with that perfect, unspoiled trust. It all changed one winter afternoon. Molly and I had gone for a hike, just like we did every Sunday. This particular Sunday, she bounded ahead, disappearing for a second behind a thick copse of pines. The sun was setting, and I remember feeling a flicker of unease in that split second she vanished from view. I called her name, and she didn't respond. A second time, louder. "Molly." Finally, she emerged from behind the trees, holding her arms out like she was playing a game. But something was off. Her eyes seemed almost too wide, and her smile too forced, like a puppet trying to mimic a child's expression. She didn't run to me. She walked, slowly, deliberately. I shivered, telling myself I was imagining things. "Daddy," she said when she finally reached me, her voice a little different, just barely out of tune. We headed home in silence, and I found myself glancing at her over and over. At dinner, she didn't eat. Instead, she just sat, watching me, and picked at her food. "Is everything okay, sweetheart?" I asked, forcing a smile. Her response was that same strange, unsettling smile. She only nodded, and after a minute, returned to stabbing her green beans with the fork. When Molly went to bed that night, she didn't ask me to read her a story, something she'd done every night since she was 3. I started to say something, but she cut me off with a look that turned my stomach. I lay awake for hours, telling myself it was all in my head. It was only later, much later, that I realized that wasn't Molly. From that day on, my daughter seemed to vanish a little more every time I looked at her. Her smile, once pure and innocent, became twisted, like she was hiding a secret only she could understand. She'd stare at me for hours, not blinking, not speaking, until I was ready to scream. Sometimes, she'd start talking to herself in whispers when she thought I couldn't hear. It sounded almost like a chant, her voice slipping into sounds that made my teeth ache. One night, she slipped into my room while I was asleep. I woke to her standing at the foot of my bed, watching me. In the faint light from the hallway, her shadow seemed to stretch, curling around her like dark smoke. She held something in her hand, but I couldn't make out what it was. "Daddy, I made this for you." She held it out, and I realized it was a small figure, a doll, carved from wood. It looked roughly like me, down to the dark circles under my eyes. Only this doll was missing its mouth. I took it from her, my hands trembling. "Thank you, sweetheart," I managed to say, hoping my voice wouldn't betray the terror in my chest. She smiled, a slow, cold smile that spread across her face like oil, and backed out of the room without a word. I threw the doll in the trash the next morning, but by nightfall, it was back on my nightstand, exactly where she placed it. One Sunday, I decided we'd go back to the woods. I had a desperate, foolish hope that maybe retracing our steps would somehow fix her, my real Molly. I wanted to believe she was trapped somewhere, and I just needed to find her. She didn't protest, but as we walked through the woods, she kept glancing at me, almost amused. We reached the grove where she'd disappeared, and I looked back, trying to remember the exact spot. The moment I turned, I heard her voice, Molly's real voice, faint, pleading, like it was coming from a mile away. "Daddy, please help me." I spun around. Molly, her face twisted in mock surprise, like a mask slipping just for a second. "Yes, Daddy." "No," I whispered, backing away. "That's not you." She laughed, a sound so cold it turned my stomach. Then she stepped closer, the shadows in the grove seeming to coil around her. "Come with me, Daddy. I want to show you something." I took a step back, shaking my head. "Where is she?" I shouted, the desperation spilling out. "What did you do to my daughter?" "She's here," she said, her voice shifting, like 100 voices all speaking in unison. "She's always been here with us." Something pulled at the edge of my vision. A figure huddled behind the trees, watching us. I could just make out her form, the real Molly. Her face streaked with tears, her eyes wide with terror. She was mouthing something over and over. "Please, Daddy, take me home." In that moment, I understood. The thing wearing my daughter's face was some kind of changeling, something that had slipped into our world through the trees. And I'd let it in. "I want my daughter back," I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. The creature smiled, and its eyes, my daughter's eyes, flashed with something ancient and hungry. "You'll have to take her." And just like that, she vanished into the trees, dragging Molly's form behind her. I chased after them, my heart pounding, but the forest swallowed me whole. Every path led nowhere. Every tree looked the same. Hours passed. I shouted until my voice was raw, begging, pleading. But the woods were silent. I found my way back alone, with nothing but the memory of her frightened eyes burned into my mind. They found me wandering along the road the next morning, my clothes torn and my skin scratched and bruised. They said I was muttering about a changeling, about a stolen child. I tried to tell them it was true, that she was still out there, waiting for me, but they didn't believe me. Months have passed, and every night I hear her voice in the wind, soft, pleading, "Please, Daddy, take me home." And now, every time I close my eyes, I see her face, twisted and inhuman, smiling back at me from the darkness. Story number 2. The House on Blackwood Lane. I wasn't planning on going back to that place. After all, the house had been abandoned for decades, and most folks in town wouldn't go near it. But some things are unavoidable when you owe your sister a favor. Jenna needed a hand clearing out the place for her new business. Some pie-in-the-sky plan about turning it into a wedding venue, of all things. I didn't know how she got the funds, but she was determined. "It's just an old house, Joe," she'd said, rolling her eyes at my hesitation. "Whatever happened in there, it's long dead. Just give me a weekend." I sighed and agreed, if only to keep an eye on her. So that weekend, I drove us both up Blackwood Lane to the crumbling Victorian monstrosity, practically swallowed by overgrown weeds and decades of neglect. Jenna had roped in her friend Ava and her fiancé Mark too, hoping more hands would make lighter work of it. We met at the front door, and I tried not to notice how Ava kept glancing over her shoulder, as if expecting someone, or something, to appear behind her. I didn't blame her. The place radiated a kind of darkness that settled deep in your bones. "Let's split up," Jenna suggested, ever the leader. "We can cover more ground that way." I exchanged a worried glance with Mark, but Jenna was already pulling Ava up the grand staircase, her flashlight casting eerie shadows that danced along the peeling walls. Mark and I took the first floor, moving through rooms thick with dust and the faint smell of rot. Everything in that house felt wrong. The rooms were silent, like even the rats didn't dare venture in. As we moved through each decaying room, we found peculiar things: mirrors covered with cloth, long-expired cans of food left in the kitchen, and rooms with strange symbols scratched into the walls, as though someone had tried to keep something at bay. Around noon, we heard Jenna scream from upstairs. Mark and I sprinted up the stairs, our flashlights flickering. Jenna and Ava stood in the hallway, staring at a door at the end of the corridor, breathing heavily. "What happened?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. We saw something," Jenna stammered. "A figure, just for a second, behind that door. It was like a shadow, watching us." Mark laughed, but it was forced. "Probably just some old mirror reflecting our lights. These places play tricks on you." But Ava shook her head. "No, it wasn't a trick. It was a man, Joe. And he smiled at us." Despite the chill creeping up my spine, I tried to shake it off. We went back to work, but the energy in the house had changed. It felt like something was awake, its eyes on us. Every now and then, I'd catch the faintest rustle, like footsteps just out of sight. We reconvened for lunch in the old dining room, none of us willing to be alone. Mark tried to lighten the mood, making jokes about ghost hunters, but no one was laughing. Ava barely touched her food, her hands trembling. She kept rubbing her arms like she was trying to get warm, even though the room was stifling. Then Jenna's flashlight flickered, and the air went deathly still. It was like someone had sucked all the sound out of the room. I strained my ears, but there was only silence, until the whispering began. It was faint, almost too low to hear, but unmistakable. A chorus of voices murmuring just beyond the walls, as if the house itself were breathing. The whispers grew louder, each voice layered over the other until they formed words. "Get out. Leave this place." I looked at Jenna, but she was staring, wide-eyed, at the far wall, her face pale. "It's them," she whispered. "The family that died here." The story was well known in town. Years ago, the Blackwood family had lived here, but something had gone terribly wrong. The entire family had been found dead in the house, their faces twisted in expressions of pure terror. People said the father had gone mad and killed them all, but no one knew for sure. Mark scoffed, his voice wavering. "Just stories. It's just old stories to scare people." Jenna shook her head. "Then why is the whispering coming from every wall, Mark?" And she was right. The voices seemed to be closing in, growing louder, more insistent. The temperature plummeted, and I saw my breath in the air. Ava looked ready to bolt, her eyes darting to the door, but something held her in place, something beyond fear. Suddenly, the lights on our flashlights flickered and died, plunging us into darkness. Then, footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from upstairs. We froze. There was no one else in the house, but someone, or something, was coming down the stairs, one heavy step at a time. Ava clung to my arm, her breathing shallow and fast. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice barely more than a whisper. The footsteps paused, and then, from the shadows at the edge of the staircase, a figure emerged. He was tall, his face hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat. His eyes glowed faintly in the dark, like embers in a dying fire. But it was his smile that twisted my stomach, a sickening grin that stretched too wide, showing teeth that were far too sharp. "Why are you here?" he asked, his voice a low, guttural rumble that seemed to reverberate through the walls. No one answered. Jenna took a step back, her hand gripping mine, her fingers ice-cold. "We're just here to clean up," she stammered, her voice trembling. The man laughed, a hollow, rattling sound. "Clean." He took another step forward, and I realized he wasn't walking. He was gliding, his feet hovering just above the ground. "This house isn't for the living. It never has been." Ava bolted, sprinting toward the front door, but it slammed shut just as she reached it. She clawed at it, screaming, but it wouldn't budge. The figure turned his gaze to her, his grin widening. "Leaving so soon?" The whispers returned, louder now, a cacophony of voices. "Join us, join us." The lights flickered back on, and the figure was gone. But the house had changed. Black mold spread across the walls, creeping like veins, and the ceiling sagged under the weight of something unseen. The walls seemed to pulse, like a living, breathing organism. The air smelled of decay, like rotting flesh. We tried every door, every window, but they wouldn't open. We were trapped. Mark tried to keep calm, mumbling reassurances to Ava, but I could see the fear in his eyes. Jenna clung to my arm, her face ashen. And then, one by one, we heard the footsteps again, coming from all directions, the house itself closing in on us, eager, hungry. The last thing I remember before the darkness swallowed us was Jenna's voice, trembling as she whispered, "It's the family, Joe. They want us to join them. And then the walls closed in, and the whispering stopped. Story number 3. Echoes of the Forgotten. I never wanted to visit the Hargrove Asylum. When you grow up in a small town, you hear stories, urban legends that everyone swears are real, but nobody believes. The Hargrove Asylum was at the center of them all. They say it was shut down overnight, left to rot with every door locked, every patient unaccounted for, and every staff member gone. It was just abandoned, or so we thought. So when my childhood friend Kyle insisted we go there on Halloween night, I knew it was a bad idea. But Kyle, along with his girlfriend Mia and her younger brother Nate, all thought it would be a fun little thrill, something to break the monotony of small-town life. "Come on, Jake," Kyle had said, nudging me. "We'll be in and out in 20 minutes, just enough time to say we went in. What's the harm?" Famous last words. The place was almost impossible to find, hidden away at the end of a dirt road, shrouded by looming trees that blocked out the moonlight. The asylum was a hulking mass of crumbling stone, its windows shattered and covered with rusted iron bars. The air around it felt heavy, like it held memories too dark to let go. We parked and made our way toward the entrance, flashlights barely cutting through the darkness. The silence was unsettling. It was the kind of silence that seemed to press down on your shoulders, like it was trying to keep you out or trap you in. Inside, the asylum was worse. Peeling paint, broken tiles, and the stench of mold filled the corridors. Our footsteps echoed, as if the walls themselves were listening. Mia was nervous, clutching Kyle's arm, and Nate's usually cocky grin was replaced with a quiet, uneasy look. But Kyle was fearless. "Come on," he whispered, just a quick look around. The hallways stretched out in every direction, each one darker than the last. We split up to cover more ground, something I regretted instantly. I stuck with Mia and Nate, while Kyle went off down another hall, laughing, pretending to be braver than he felt. As we moved deeper, strange things began to happen. Shadows flickered just outside the beam of my flashlight, and the temperature seemed to drop with every step we took. I thought I heard whispers, soft and barely audible, like someone was trying to warn us or lure us in. Then we heard Kyle scream. It wasn't a playful scream, the kind he would use to mess with us. This was raw, panicked, the kind of scream that makes your blood run cold. We sprinted toward the sound, my heart pounding, Mia's hand gripping my arm so tightly it hurt. We found him standing in a small dark room, staring at the walls. His face was pale, eyes wide, breath ragged. "What happened?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Kyle just pointed at the walls. There, scratched into the peeling paint, were words. "We are still here. Do not disturb the forgotten." It's just graffiti, right?" Nate tried to sound brave, but his voice trembled. Kyle shook his head. "No, I saw something. It was watching me." His voice cracked. I felt it. We huddled together, trying to make sense of what he'd seen, when we heard it. A low, guttural moan that seemed to come from deep within the walls. Then the lights on our flashlights began to flicker, casting shadows that twisted and shifted in ways that didn't make sense. Nate turned to me, his face pale. "Jake, something's wrong here. We need to leave. Now." But every hallway seemed different from when we'd come in, like the building itself had changed, twisting and turning to trap us inside. We took turn after turn, but we couldn't find the exit. And that's when we saw them. Figures, just barely visible at the edges of our flashlight beams. Silent, staring, their eyes empty, faces gaunt. They were wearing old patient gowns, their skin pale and stretched tight over hollow cheekbones. One by one, they appeared, lining the hallways, watching us with those vacant eyes. They're the patients," Mia whispered, clutching my arm. "The ones who never left." Kyle took a step back, his flashlight shaking in his hand. "This isn't real," he muttered. "It can't be real." But the figures moved closer, their movements slow, deliberate, as if they had all the time in the world to trap us. And then one of them spoke, its voice soft and brittle, like dry leaves scraping against stone. "Why have you come?" it asked, tilting its head in a slow, unnatural way. "Why disturb our rest?" None of us could speak. Fear had stolen our voices. The figure reached out, its hand twisted and skeletal, and it pointed down the hall. "You don't belong here. Leave, if you can." Then the lights on our flashlights cut out completely, plunging us into darkness. I don't remember how long we stumbled through the blackness, our hands pressed against the cold walls, feeling our way forward. The whispers grew louder, voices overlapping, echoing in our minds. We heard names, snippets of conversations, fragments of memories trapped in the walls. I could feel hands brushing against me, soft but ice-cold, like the dead themselves were reaching out. Finally, we found a door, and with a burst of adrenaline, we shoved it open. But what lay beyond wasn't the outside. It was another room. And in the middle of the room stood an old metal gurney, rusted and covered in dark stains. And there, lying on it, was a figure. No, not just a figure. It was Kyle. He was strapped down, his eyes wide and glassy, mouth open in a silent scream. But he was standing beside me, wasn't he? I turned, but the Kyle who'd been with us was gone, vanished into thin air. And the figure on the gurney was moving. It sat up slowly, eyes locking onto us, a twisted, nightmarish grin stretching across its face. "You can't leave," it whispered, its voice mingling with the chorus of voices in the walls. "None of us can leave." I don't remember how we got out. I remember running, the walls closing in, the screams echoing behind us, and the shadows reaching out to pull us back. But somehow we made it outside, gasping for air, hearts pounding. We looked around, but Kyle was gone. Only Mia, Nate, and I had made it out. And when we looked back at the asylum, it was dark and silent, the shadows behind the windows watching us, waiting. They never found Kyle. The town called it an accident, said he must have wandered off somewhere and gotten lost. But we know what happened. And every Halloween, I hear those whispers, soft and beckoning, as if they're still waiting for us to return, to finish what we started. We left that night, but we left a part of ourselves behind. And the asylum never forgets. It's always there, waiting, biding its time. And I know, one day, it'll call us back,